we're really thrilled to host tonight's conversation, and I'm sure that it's going to enrich our understanding of the arts landscape, not only in Detroit, but kind of around the world, or around the country. So Rip Rapson is the president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation, which is a national private foundation based in metropolitan Detroit with programs in arts and culture, community development, education, and far beyond. Prior to joining Kresge, he was president of the McKnight Foundation, where he launched initiatives supporting the arts and economic development in Minnesota. An attorney and expert in urban policy, he has served as a senior fellow at the University of Minnesota and the deputy mayor of Minneapolis under Don Fraser, where he served as the primary architect of the neighborhood revitalization program. He's the author of 2 books, Troubled Waters, detailing his essential involvement in the development of legislation protecting the boundary waters, and Ralph Rapson, 60 Years of Modern Design, which is a biography of his renowned architect father. Jamie Bennett, our other guest this evening, is the executive director of ArtPlace America, which is a collaboration of 14 foundations, 8 federal agencies, and 6 financial institutions dedicated to strengthening the field of creative placemaking. ArtPlace invests in projects where artists and arts organizations play a central role in shaping their community's social, physical, and economic futures. Prior to joining ArtPlace, Jamie served as the chief of staff at NEA, a position he held previously here at our very own New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and Office of the President at Columbia University. He's also held positions at MoMA, the New York Philharmonic, and served on the board of directors for Art 21 and here Art Center. So please join me, seeing Kristen Martin's here. Please join me in welcoming Rip Rapson and Jamie Bennett.
So this should be interesting because when Rip and I met to get ready for tonight, we each thought we were interviewing the other. So I think this is Rip's show.
I think it's clearly Jamie's show.
Yes, so that should be good. So what we had talked about doing was essentially an evening in 3 acts. And we thought we might begin by laying a little bit of groundwork, just some context for what Kresge does, what ArtPlace does, talking a little bit about this notion of creative placemaking, a subset of placemaking. Then walk through a couple specific examples of some really great things that are happening in Detroit and focusing on some of the bright spots, and then open it up to a conversation and dialogue with all of you guys, and sort of standing in the back of the room and looking who's walking in. That's actually the bit I'm looking most forward to, with Americans for the Arts represented, and Project for Public Spaces, and Times Square Alliance, and all sorts of great organizations here in the house. So I don't know if you want to add any preamble.
No, the only preamble, I think, is that if you get itchy and feel that you really want to take the 3rd act and insert it into the 1st, let us know. I mean, we'll try to be flexible. I mean, it would be fun to really mix it up a little bit.
Rip is the rare foundation president who wants to talk less.
Right.
So, Rip, one of the things that might be an interesting place to begin is, particularly under your leadership, Kresge is an organization that cares about cities and how cities function on behalf of the people who live in them. So sort of within that framework, you guys are an extraordinary art supporter. And just how, I mean, that's not totally expected in the world today.
Well, you know, it's interesting. When we, about a year and a half ago, we tried to really narrow our focus to what it might mean to work in low-income opportunity in cities, with an emphasis both on cities and on low-income opportunity. And what we found was that made complete sense, and there was sort of complete alignment with a human services program, or with a community development program, or with a health program. But it wasn't quite as clear how that fit with an arts and culture program. Kresge, for many, many years, was a supporter of capital programs all across the country. There are very few art centers across the country that didn't sort of bear some Kresge influence at one point or another over the last 50 years. And as a result, we tended to gravitate sort of toward capital support. And lots of fine projects, a ton in New York and everywhere else. But when we began getting serious about this idea of what it really means to create the kind of opportunity structures you need in cities in order to make them sort of vibrant and healthful places, we asked our arts team to sort of think about what might that look like in the realm of arts and culture. And they went through a process of talking to folks all across the country and trying to understand whether there might be some niche for the philanthropic community to really think about how arts and culture can build and help revitalize communities in which there have been high levels of disinvestment, high levels of community disengagement, and to move more toward a sense of how arts and culture can actually contribute in an integral way to the arc of revitalization in some of America's poorest cities. Talk a little bit later about Detroit if you'd like, but it was not necessarily a natural act for our arts program to do that. And I think we were sort of aided in the sort of the serendipity of about the same time, Rocco Landisman, Jamie will talk about that in just a moment, coming to the National Endowment and trying to articulate a more activist role for the idea of inserting arts and culture into the revitalization path of places across the country. And so we teamed up fairly early on with Ford and a handful of others to try to make sense out of that. And yet our sort of slice of the work is, I think, sort of a subset of what Jamie is doing, which is to try to really zero in on how low-income communities both can give structure to issues of community revitalization through their engagement in arts and culture, but also reflect back community identity, community history, and in ways that I think have been fascinating to watch unfold. So over the last year, we've begun building out a portfolio that I think looks a little bit different from a more typical arts portfolio.
And so one of the things that Rip and his colleagues have done, I think, in terms of building that portfolio is use this sort of notion of creative placemaking. And it's a phrase, it's kind of a back formation. Particularly folks who are in the architecture and design and urban planning fields know the whole school of placemaking thought. And this guy, Rocco Landisman, who, since we're in the Segal Center, I assume a lot of you know, former Broadway producer, who was chairman of the NEA for 4 years. He's the person whose chief of staff I served as, and who has nice overlap with Rip in a number of different ways. Showed up in Washington, and I think like every NEA chairman, his opening gambit was to double the size of the NEA's budget. And I think maybe that lasted until the first Thursday that he was there. And he realized that that maybe wasn't going to be in the cards in 4 years. An important goal, and folks are working on it, but one of the things that Rocco really wanted to do was move the arts, as he said, to the grown-ups table, right? He wanted to sort of join in serious policy conversations. And he called together a conversation, and it was you, it was Darren Walker, who was then, I think, leaving Rockefeller to eventually become president of the Ford Foundation, and a number of other foundation president colleagues. And when Rocco called you, what was the meeting he invited you to? What did you think you were showing up to?
I thought he was going to ask me how to double the NEA budget. That wasn't what he had in mind. I mean, he was really taken with two things. One was the Our Town program, Our Town program that was so focused on the power of arts, in particularly smaller places, to move a community in a different direction. And second, I think he was really taken with the notion that somehow the federal government and the philanthropic sector and the arts community could form a different kind of partnership. And that when you sort of put those different sectors together, a different kind of synergy might be possible. And so he said, what would you think if somehow we could get the National Endowment to partner with the philanthropic community, and I'll take care of the national government folks, and I'll go get departments of transportation and housing and labor to sort of figure out how they might incorporate arts into their work. If you could figure out a way to sort of spread this notion of arts as a sort of a creative placemaking tool, then we might actually have something. And I think one of the real successes, and Jamie has just in a very short time just put a very distinctive stamp on this, the idea that the government in its sort of most enlightened moments can actually be a great partner to cities that are trying to incorporate arts more fully into the long-term reimagination of their place. And it's been, I think, an extraordinary partnership. It was begun by Rocco, but I think in Jamie we have someone who has actually lived it on the ground in a very different way. When we interviewed for the director of ArtPlace, we had a whole suite of folks who had done extraordinary things in the art. But as the introduction suggested, I'm not sure it's possible to invent Jamie. I mean, there is for a lot of reasons we won't talk about.
Some of them G-rated.
But the idea of someone who has worked on the ground with real living, breathing arts organizations, who has sort of arced up into municipal policy and tried to understand what the contextual work is for arts organizations to thrive, to then arc up on yet another rung into national policy and national funding and national collaborations. It's really an extraordinary moment, I think, for the arts community to have someone of Jamie's skill and background in the mix.
Well, that's the thing that was sort of extraordinary to me, of course, was watching Rip and his colleagues.
Yeah.
And, you know, I started out my life as a grant writer. And we were just talking in 1994, I was writing grant applications when I was working at New York Philharmonic, largely to foundations. And we all know that if there's one thing foundations are known for, it's making making real decisions real quickly. And so at this meeting of, I think, 11 or 12 foundation presidents, Rocco said, I'm really taken with this notion of creative placemaking. I'm looking at ways that people are doing art with the goal of changing the social, physical, or economic character of a place. So it's a subset of arts projects, right? Not every project is looking to define its success in place-based terms. But for those that are, there's a very real change that you can see. And one of the things that Rocco was fond of quoting was our last mayor in New York City, Mayor Bloomberg, who talked about wherever he traveled in the world, anyone could name 2 streets in New York City. And the first was always Wall Street, but the second was always Broadway. And so we were a city that very much had an identity and a shape that was sort of formed by the arts. So Rocco brought this notion of creative placemaking forward and said, what if we took a look at arts projects that really saw themselves as active citizens, as active neighbors in a community? And what if we use that as a frame for investment? And I think at the end of a maybe 15-minute meeting, led, if I remember correctly, maybe by Don Randall, who was then president of the Mellon Foundation, sort of said, I love it, I'm in. And I think all the other foundation presidents said, what just happened?
Yeah, this is what, I don't know, in Michigan this would be remarkably inside baseball, in New York it is probably not, but you had all of these sort of activist foundations, Bloomberg, Kresge, Ford, Rockefeller, and then you had Mellon, who is a great foundation, but is pretty careful and pretty studied and takes its time and doesn't rush to judgment. And so while the rest of us were sort of saying, oh, it's a lot of money, and I'm not sure I can't figure out quite how to partner with the public sector, and who is this Rocco guy anyway? Didn't he do Big River, and that wasn't so great? But so Don just sort of leaps in the middle, and it's probably not particularly interesting, but I think it suggests the degree to which even fairly traditional arts or philanthropies have sort of come to this work, and since then we've added a bunch. We've got a foundation from Alaska, 2 or 3 foundations from California, a foundation from Minnesota. So my sense is that this is not necessarily sort of the traditional sort of East Coast centric approach to the world where we know the arts are powerful engines in all dimensions. But I think in some of these more traditional, even some of these more conservative places, this has really sort of gotten into the water system. It's been fun to watch.
Yeah, so today, just to give you sort of a little update, ArtPlace is a project. We're not an organization, which is one of many things that really attracted me to this job, which is that the foundations, we're now 14 foundations strong, as well as 8 federal agencies and 6 banks and financial institutions, have said that we want to try and do something over 10 years. We want to try and get something done by 2020, and at the end of it, we want to say either we've succeeded, good job on us, or we failed, on to the next thing. And it's been a sort of iterative process, but I think that what we're trying to accomplish by 2020, and it's always good to try out a new idea on your boss in front of an audience, right? Everyone's on company behavior.
Hold on.
So I think, because my colleague Liz Crane, who's the deputy director of ArtPlace, is here. And we had a founding executive director, who's an extraordinary woman called Carol Coletta, who had an opportunity after running ArtPlace for 3 years to go in-house at the Knight Foundation, and is now doing extraordinary work for them. But when she made that move, she took some of her team with her, and ArtPlace was Liz. So the state was Liz. Liz was the state. But we went through this process of interviewing a bunch of people because we were staffing back up. And in the course of doing something like 34 back-to-back interviews, I learned some stuff about myself and about ArtPlace. Because there's that neat moment at the end of every interview where you say, and do you have any questions for me? And the person has dutifully written down 3 intelligent questions. And one of them always was, so what does success look like for ArtPlace? Yeah. And I think, and I've tried this out on your colleagues who said this would work, that really our goal is that in 2020, anytime someone is seeding a conversation about the future of a community, anytime someone is having a conversation about planning or developing a community, we want arts and culture one of the sectors at the table. We want them a co-equal with housing, transportation, public safety, art and culture, open space, education. And that we should be seen.
And labor, don't forget.
And labor, yes, no, I think their number, that was not an exclusive list, it was merely a taste. So I think that the point is that these are all sectors, including labor, that need planning and investment from their communities and also have a responsibility to contribute to the future of their community. So I think our goal is really to change standard operating procedure and change the way mayors and deputy mayors, because we all know those are more important than mayors when you're on stage with a former deputy mayor, really sort of change that. And the way we're going to do that is by giving them some examples. Here are some things that work. So do you think we're ready to talk a little bit about Detroit, or do you want to add anything?
Sure. But again, coming from the heartland, what I think may be sort of self-apparent to folks in New York is a hard swallow in other places. I mean, there is such a tremendous integration of arts and culture into almost everything a New Yorker does, whether it's a transportation project, or it's a High Line project, whether it's the reclamation of the waterfront. I mean, it's in your DNA, I think, coupled with tremendously, visionary leadership. But in the rest of the world, art is really, in many cases, sort of an afterthought. And it's almost as if they're sort of standing outside the fence line looking in. And if they're asked to participate and throw up a mural or do something creative to spice something up, they're asked to participate. And I think the really good examples that Jamie and Liz have been excavating over these last years defy that. I mean, it is when you sort of get into the mix and when you're sort of battling it out with traffic engineers or with housing developers or with community-based health professionals and sort of asking the question of how do you create an artistic and cultural expression that is more than just adornment. It can be adornment, that's nothing wrong with that. But how does it sort of speak back to create a sort of a sense of place? How does it speak back to create a sense of community identity, a sense of community participation, community voice? And I think that it sounds so simple, but I actually think it's an uphill slog. And I think what we're trying to do is just show what it looks like, as Jamie suggested, show that it is not as hard as it is sometimes made out to be, and that the results are exponentially more interesting, more sustainable, and I think sort of more impactful in terms of the way it sort of helps really create a sort of a sense of identity and direction for a community.
No, I think that's exactly right, because oftentimes when people, I think, in earlier iterations talked about the importance of the arts, we would talk about two things that the arts did. And we would often talk about their economic impact, and we would often talk about the foot traffic that they sort of naturally bring with them. And I think both of those things are true. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is your arm of the federal government that calculates this country's gross domestic product, or GDP, recently created a satellite account to look at what art and culture contributes to the US economy. And it's $504 billion every year. It's 2011 numbers. And that works out to be 3.2% of GDP. And just to place that in some context, travel and tourism is 2.8%. So as an industry, art and culture is a bigger thing than travel and tourism. Now, to a lot of us in the arts, my background, I came to the city to study theater at a different institution. But, I didn't choose a career in the theater because I wanted to make an economic impact, right? So sometimes those arguments ring a little false to arts people because it wasn't my motivation, but it doesn't mean it's not true, right? Just because it's not why I chose to do that doesn't mean it's not happening. So the other thing that a lot of people talk about is the foot traffic, right? And different kinds of arts organizations have different patterns of foot traffic. A theater has 500 people show up at 8 o'clock and walk out at 10:30. So that's really great in terms of activating a block for 2 hours a day. Mm-hmm. So maybe next to that theater, you put a visual arts organization. And a museum maybe has 500 people who walk in and out of it over the course of an 8-hour day. So all of a sudden now you've got 10 hours of positive foot traffic. So maybe you add in some rehearsal studios, some musician studios, or some maker spaces. And maybe now you have 10 or 15 people walking in and out every hour. So that's a sort of natural byproduct of the arts. It doesn't change what they're doing. But, and this is what I think is so powerful about what Rip just said, there are other things that do that, right? If you want to have an economic impact and drive foot traffic, you could build a sports stadium, you could build a big box store, you could build a new subway stop, right? All of those things would do it. But it's that collection of things that Rip was just talking about that I think are the unique value add of the arts, because they're the things that we do that no one does better, right? We drive attachment to community, we shape community identity, we cause people who are culturally involved are more likely to engage in civic activities beyond the arts. Arts people are more likely to vote and volunteer, right? They become better citizens, more active citizens. I think the arts contribute to individual resiliency and do all of the things that you're articulating. And so I think it's that entire spectrum, right? It's the economic development, foot traffic, but it's also the unique value add of what we do that really makes it powerful. And as we're in this moment in this country where we're needing to continually do more with less, the other thing that I think is really powerful about the arts is that they exist everywhere. Mm-hmm. Not every neighborhood has waterfront access. Not every neighborhood has a major university in it. Not every neighborhood has any of the other things that are so important to community development. But I spent 4 years at the NEA traveling the country and 4 months at ArtPlace traveling the country, and I've never come to a neighborhood where there isn't music, where there isn't painting, where there isn't textile work, where all of this sort of creates. So it's an asset that everyone has, so why not activate it?
One of my favorite stories is when I was in Minneapolis Deputy Mayor, we launched something called, what's it called? Culture Talks, I think. Anyway, it's an attempt to do much of this, but this is ancient history, and I remember going into the ward of the most conservative council member. We had big, huge hockey player kind of guy, and we thought, well, how can we sort of convince him to get on board? And so we took him to a Ukrainian church, and of course, the woman who did the vestments was there, and the woman who did the eggs was there, and the minister was there, and I mean, and you began sort of assembling all of these pieces of the fabric, and it ended up that this guy, Walter Dietzick, ended up being sort of the great, sort of passionate advocate for community-based arts. He didn't have much time for the stuff on the hill, right. The high art, but he really became, over the next decade, one of the really interesting sort of advocates for the role of informal, day-to-day, ebb and flow kind of art that can so powerfully transform a community's identity.
Anyway, I think that's exactly right. So I think we're going to dive into a couple specific examples from Detroit just to sort of illustrate some of the things that the arts can do and arts organizations can do in terms of shaping a place. So if we could go to the next slide. This is an organization called MoCAD, Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, and it's located on Woodward Avenue. And can you just say a word about how Woodward functions in the city?
Woodward is essentially the spine of the city. It runs, the Detroit River is to the south, and Woodward goes north and south up about 35 miles. It goes through all of the suburbs, and sort of all the arterials sort of hang off of Woodward. And maybe, can I back up just a half step? Because Detroit is on people's minds in lots of different ways.
And just so we know, how many people here have been to Detroit?
Oh my.
Excellent.
How many people have been to Detroit in the last 4 years? Oh, okay. Well, so maybe I don't need to say...
No, back up, because that's not half of the audience.
Well, it's just, it is so easy, I think, to read the newspaper accounts and to consider the sort of the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, and basically sort of put Detroit in a kind of a box that well-meaning people may be a little bit more charitable about, and less well-meaning people might just say, turn off the lights and start over again. But what I think is maybe the back end to the Woodward Corridor conversation is that 6 or 7 years ago, even before the bankruptcy was brewing, a number of things began sort of converging in Detroit, which I think have the potential to help sort of redefine not only it as a city, but what it means to be sort of a post-industrial city. It's never going to be Boston, never going to be New York, it's never going to be San Francisco or Portland, but it might be Pittsburgh, it might be any number of other places. And one of the ways that that has become sort of most powerfully expressed is in the power of sort of this generative energy that comes from artists. And because Detroit has been in almost free fall for so many years, it's almost like the Wild Wild West. We have, you've seen the pictures of abandoned houses and these great swaths of land that look like North Dakota. I mean, it's wild, and all of that is true. And part of the upside of that is that creative young people, largely, not exclusively, but creative young people, both who are from Detroit and who are not from Detroit, have sort of put their minds to work to think about how do you take it from the debit side of the ledger, all of this land, all of this lack of structure, all of this sort of anything goes kind of mentality.
Empty spaces.
And the spaces, absolutely.
Empty spaces.
Yeah. Empty spaces.
Oh, empty spaces, yes, absolutely. And switch it over to the asset side of the ledger. And so we've seen this incredible infusion of folks, both Detroiters coming back, young people choosing to stay, people who have never set foot in Detroit coming. And it's all, not all, so much of it has been clustered around arts as small business development, arts as just a way of playing out self-expression, obviously, but arts also as a community development driver. And so for years and years and years, the Detroit Woodward Corridor was dominated by the Detroit Institute of Art. The Detroit Institute of Arts and a couple of other high-level institutions, the opera, the symphony, a handful of others, really were the sort of the definitional cultural icons of the city. But as the city began to change and people needed a different kind of outlet than just going into the Detroit Institute of Art and looking at a spectacular collection or going once a month to the opera, they were looking for sort of a more ongoing way to sort of engage this new energy. And so they took this old car dealership along Woodward Avenue, which is just down, and this is just down the road from the DIA. And the DIA, the Detroit Institute of Art, fought him tooth and nail. It was, well, we don't need it. It's going to be a drain on our resources. It's sub-quality art. You might imagine. And I don't mean to be disrespectful of the DIA because they ended up coming around. And these folks said, well, but you need some portal for all of this energy. How are we going to sort of bring in this energy? How do you sort of get something that's not 19th century Venetian? I mean, how do you get stuff in the mix that sort of helps the community understand that arts can take multiple forms? And in many ways, this project became the very first sort of outpost of the reclamation of the art scene by a sort of a much more grassroots and sort of mezzo-level group of folks in Detroit. And I think in many ways, it's not really been talked about this way. It sort of started this notion that the arts in Detroit don't just have to be about these big major arts institutions, as incredibly important and valuable as they are. That there can be sort of forms of self-expression that can drive a very different kind of engagement. So this has been a remarkable success.
Well, and the other thing that I think is so interesting that's embedded in that is, I started out doing fundraising for nonprofit arts organizations. And that can be a very scary position because you feel like you're in competition. You're in competition with the other nonprofit arts organizations. If your theater company gets a grant, that's a grant that I'm not going to get. And we tend to, this is a framework that I borrow from our friends at Howell Round, who I think a lot of you in the audience know. We operate from a sort of frame of scarcity. And we're sort of always focused on what we don't have and what we need. And I think what MOCAD and the DIA discovered is that more is more.
Absolutely.
Right? As we, I think, all reflect in our lived experience, if I like going to one museum, I like going to another museum. When I was in Washington, D.C., I had subscriptions to 3 theaters. They all knew that made me more likely to take out a 4th subscription than someone who didn't have any. And so I think there's a real power that was shown that if we really make ourselves welcoming to everyone, and if we draw the ribbon around all of Woodward and all of the arts, that are in Detroit along Woodward Avenue. It's a really powerful moment.
Yeah, and it actually, surprisingly, it took, and I'm sure there are folks here who can speak more thoughtfully about this, but it took some pressure off the curators because the DIA was constantly being criticized for not showing local artists, not showing up, more edgy art, and they ended up sort of developing a sort of an understanding that there was lots of room and actually some increasing overlap. And so temporary shows will move in and out of the two. So it's I think been remarkable. Now, they live on the edge every day, as you can imagine. Financially, it's a tough pull, and they got through the recession, the 2008-2009 period, and kept their doors open the entire time, and really created a total.
That's great. And if we go to the next slide, what's interesting is this is a church, former church, deconsecrated on just off Woodward Avenue, right on Woodward Avenue. That's actually going to be the newest addition, right? Things are going so well in Detroit. We need new places and new organizations. So this is going to be a performing arts center that's being developed by Sue Mosey's group, who's doing so much extraordinary work. And as one of the indicators for why we need this and why there's room for this, do you know offhand what the current occupancy rates are right along Woodward?
Oh, it's interesting. Again, Woodward and the river form this T, and the vast open spaces that you all know are sort of to the east and to the west. But over the last 5 or 6 years, we've really doubled down on the avenue, not just in terms of cultural moves, but also in terms of just trying to attract new residential activity and commercial activity. Right now, the occupancy rate in Midtown is 100%. You cannot get an apartment.
Midtown Detroit.
I'm sorry, Midtown Detroit.
Midtown Detroit.
Yeah, Midtown. It's probably about that here too.
No, I don't know that we get it.
The point is that for years and years you couldn't build to the market because it cost so much more than you could get in rents, right? It's just that, and what's happened is that those lines are beginning to cross. And again, I don't mean to sound like the Chamber of Commerce. It's part of maybe a larger conversation. But what I think has suggested a very different trajectory for Detroit going forward is the fact that the market has sort of come back and understood that not just in residential, but in commercial and in retail, there actually is a market that can be tapped. And so, actually what Jamie didn't mention is that this was in the very first round of grants of ArtPlace. Carol Coletta, Jamie's predecessor, was really convinced that if you could build out a district in Detroit to model this kind of idea that we've been discussing, that it would catch. And in fact, it's taken longer to build it out for lots of reasons. I mean, these projects are complicated and it involves more than what you just see on the screen. But it's exactly what's happened, is that as this has sort of gotten built out, gotten established in concentric circles, sure enough, what happens always happens. People began wanting to live close by, restaurants popped up, little boutiques popped up. It's been, again, I think it's second nature so often for those of us from New York, but for Detroit, this was a very different phenomenon, that you could actually drive these kinds of occupancy rates and retail and commercial activity.
So I'm gonna, this is a warning to the booth, I'm gonna go slightly out of order. So if you could advance to slide 6, which is the video. Oh. And Rip, this is a project that's happening in Livernois.
Oh.
So this is different than Woodward. So can you position us on how this neighborhood works? Do you need another hand?
I need another hand, yeah. So this is Woodward, and it's almost like an old Haussmann plan in Detroit, these big, grand boulevards. And Livernois Avenue ran northwest and southeast off of Woodward. And as you moved up Livernois, it was the absolute center of black commerce in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s in Detroit. It was called the Avenue of Fashion. And it was hat shops and barber shops. I mean, just everything you might imagine. And it was the probably most vital part of Detroit. And it has become, in the last 20 years, 30 years, almost completely abandoned, disinvested. It's really been one of the great sort of tragedies to watch this once great commercial corridor to fall away. But I haven't seen this video, but I assume that the video will suggest the extent to which that may be reversed.
Yeah, so this was a project where the Detroit Economic Growth Association worked with artists and local entrepreneurs and did a series of pop-up retail and permanent retail, sort of very specifically rooted in place, right? This wasn't random that they picked Livernois to do this. It was building on the tradition that was there. And there are lots of people. I was in Detroit last week, I can't remember when I saw you, last week, and met people who talked about shopping as young people on this avenue. So this video only runs, I think, about 2.5 minutes, but it gives you a really neat sense of someplace that's not as advanced as Woodward, but I think could become another corridor, could become another spot.
And Steve Davies from Project for Public Spaces, have we gotten you guys involved on Livernois? Have we gotten you guys involved on Livernois, or?
Yeah, no, we've been with them.
Okay, this is Project for...
No other pop quizzes. Everyone else will No one else will be called up. Maybe Ira, I have a question for you, but other than that. So with that, let's run the video.
There's 1.5 billion reasons to start a business in Detroit. It's the number of dollars Detroiters spend on retail outside the city every year. It's a huge pot of money that entrepreneurs should be able to capture back in the city. The demand amongst the entrepreneurs far exceeds the supply of move and ready space. There's like this misconception there's tons of space in Detroit. There's a ton of space with a ton of problems. What we try to do at Revolve is to take on one part of that equation. We won an ArtPlace grant. So we were investing in artists to make over spaces and create this truly unique retail environment, something that's never been done before in Detroit, something that would create a destination that was unique in and of itself.
On the avenue of fashion, you got a lot of places that have a lot of issues. However, we're working through it, and we're not afraid to take it on. When I heard about the Revolve program, and I thought, I could be part of this change.
By investing in the space, we've created a more feasible environment for a business to invest in a business. Investing in the avenue of fashion through the arts was a very important thing to do because it's historically significant. It needed to be elevated again, and it was always important to try to build on that legacy. Since we won the grant on May 20th, and we launched with DDF on September 20th. 4 months, 2 blocks, 10 vacant storefronts, 3 public spaces, 31 projects. That timeline was excruciating. Not only did we have to do all the work, we had to get ready to show it off to thousands of people. The opportunity then to bring a lot of people out to see it through the Detroit Design Festival. For the first time, DDF had gotten out of Greater Downtown. Sharing the story with a larger audience, telling the good things about Detroit is how we're going to bring more people here. More resources, more money through the door. That's the key. You saw the street literally packed from the Lodge to 8 Mile. Hundreds of people on the sidewalks, out in the rain to experience kind of this revival.
That was a major change. I mean, you saw some of everyone coming to this neighborhood, black, white, young, old, rich, poor, gay, straight. They were all here. No one cared. They just wanted to be in a community.
There's still a long ways to go. Still a lot more work that needs to be done. Small piece of history and a very long history, but there are so many great things about this community. There's so many reasons to come. We just need to get people to come here.
And one of the things that was so amazing being there was we got to meet some of the entrepreneurs who had done these businesses. We were there with Michael, who you saw speak in the video, and they were sitting, in their minds, I'm their grant maker, right? Yeah. So I'm their ATM. So they're sitting at a table with me. And they had this unbelievably honest and collegial conversation about what was working and what didn't. And they were able to sort of speak as colleagues about this really stinked, this worked great, much better than I thought it was. What should we do differently? What do we need to do next? And what was so amazing is everyone was invested in being there and making it work. And how do we really revitalize this as a home for artists and a home for entrepreneurs? So, I mean, what do you think is next for Livernois? Do you think this is the momentum?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Because along Livernois, I think along most of the great avenues of Detroit, are these sort of remnants of great residential neighborhoods. And what the residential neighborhoods have lacked are 2 things. One are good schools, which continue to be a challenge, obviously. But second are commercial nodes. And so people would get in their cars and drive 5 or 10 miles north to the suburbs to do their shopping. And after a while, you think, well, why should I be living here? And so I think what's happening is it's helping to stabilize the neighborhoods, and it just becomes sort of this virtuous circle. in which the neighborhoods feed the commercial centers feed the neighborhoods. And if we can ever get our transit system up and working at a proper level, you can actually imagine sort of the connective tissue that might occur between Livernois and downtown, or Woodward and somewhere to the east. And so I think it's this sort of notion almost of a stew, of having these sort of clumpy pieces that are healthy and vibrant, and they just sort of get bigger and bigger.
I love that. Clumpy and vibrant. That's great. I think I know a couple of people who are clumpy and vibrant. So with that, why don't we move one slide ahead just so we have some people on the screen behind us. These are just shots of people in place. And why don't we turn up the lights in the house a little bit? And we'd love to sort of enter into a conversation with you guys about things that are on topic, off topic. The woman has been chomping at the bit.
Is anyone...
And just say who you are, just so we know who we're talking with.
I'm Debbie Cochran. I'm passionate about theater. I go every day to the theater.
Fantastic.
And I love these cultural events. I would like to know if anybody in government or the philanthropic community is embarrassed by the fact that America has no national theater.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it'll be really interesting, particularly as Deborah Rutter succeeds Michael Kaiser at the Kennedy Center, because there's certainly a world in which some people think that the Kennedy Center functions as this country's national theater. There are other people, I'm guessing you're one of them by the rolling of your eyes, that don't think that's the case. And there's certainly been attempts to do that. I'm just curious, if you were going to build a national theater, what would you sort of have it do? Where would you begin?
I find the WP...
Oh, I'm sorry, there's a microphone. I forgot a very important stage director.
In American history, one of the very shining moments was the spirit behind the WPA. I think that has never been replicated after that. And I would like to see you all revive that spirit and that mindset.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I think it's interesting because the impulse, I think, about connecting artists with community and seeing artists as vital contributors to their community is a very similar impulse. So I think this is coming out. Diane, did you want to get in, or you were?
Not yet.
Okay, excellent. She's coming. How are you? Other questions? Do we have?
1 second, we'll take the mic.
Oh, excellent. Yes, and if you just speak in the mic because we have those friends online and they want to hear you as well.
I'm not sure
And,
that
and
this
who are,
is
just so we know who we're talking to.
Elaine.
Hi, Elaine.
I'm not sure that this is significantly important to your statistic, but when you said that art was what, 3 point something percent?
3.2% of GDP.
Did you include movie making in that?
Mm-hmm.
And if the answer is yes, which I see it is, did that not disproportionately raise the percentage, considering what each movie brings in the billions of dollars?
So I would push you a little on that to sort of unpack what you mean by disproportionately. So I was at the NEA when we were working with the BEA on setting up the satellite account. And the thing that was so interesting to me about this project was the thing that was never a headline. In creating the satellite account, we had to create a definition of what the US government believed was art and culture, right? What were we going to count and what weren't we going to count? And there was a big conversation about should it just be not-for-profit or do we also want to include commercial? And where folks ended up is the average consumer, someone who's enjoying an art event, doesn't really recognize that divide. And if I want to read a book, I want to read it because it's compelling, and I don't really care if it was on a commercial press or nonprofit. If I want to see a film, maybe I see it at a nonprofit film festival, maybe I see it in Lowe's. If I want to go hear Wynton Marsalis, maybe I see him at Jazz at Lincoln Center, maybe I see him at the Blue Note. And so they decided that they were going to count everything. And what's interesting to me is the things they only counted some of. So you have an industry like performing arts centers that's 100% in. And then you have an industry like healthcare that's pretty much 100% out. But then you get to an industry like advertising. And what do you do with advertising? And what the BEA did, and what makes this project so interesting, is they counted the actors, they counted the art directors, they counted the graphic designers, and then they excluded everything else. So the money, the postage that you pay for direct mail isn't really art and culture, so that got excluded. So if you're interested in digging in and sort of seeing what gets counted and what wasn't counted, all of the data is available both on the BEA website and on the National Endowment for the Arts, which is arts.gov. And you can take a look at what's in and what's out. And I think it's really interesting. They included for-profit galleries and auction houses alongside not-for-profit museums and other sort of spaces. And I think it's a really interesting conversation that we need to have as a country about does this all work the same? Does it all get to be counted? I don't know if you have anything you want to say. No. Excellent. I lost track of where we have our mic. We have a friend over here.
Hi, I'm Marianne Newman. I started a foundation for Catalan culture.
Oh, excellent.
I'm really curious. I love your vision of the arts as being part of being at the table in the end with all the other departments of government. And I'm wondering how you are talking now about, let's say, bringing the Department of Transportation into the arts. Would this be an example of this? And do you have other examples of how other government agencies are participating in this?
One of the, and I'll let Jamie talk, but one of the truly wondrous things about Rocco was that he had, in some ways, so little to lose. I mean, he's a wealthy Broadway producer. He came to the NEA with sort of his own vision. He wasn't going to get more money. And so he really went to work trying to convince other agencies of government that they ought to join with him on this. And I'll never forget a meeting that Rocco asked, well, would you come to the White House and meet with some of the folks from the administration? I thought, sure, of course. So we go and sit in the conference room, and we had 10 cabinet secretaries. We had the chief of staff of the White House. We had 15 of the top folks in the federal government, and each one went around the table without notes to talk about how Health and Human Services was incorporating the arts into sort of healing processes, how the Department of Agriculture was doing something at the extension level. It went on and on. Ray LaHood, the Secretary of Transportation, talked about how, as they do sort of new light rail routes, they're trying to think about those as sort of excuses to have artists help organize the community around the event. And one of the big questions I think we have in the current ArtPlace is that without Rocco, you don't have someone sort of gumshoeing around the halls of the federal agencies. But I think that there was enough buy-in in his 2 or 3 or 4 years there so that it got down into their water system a little bit. And we continue to have representatives of the federal government, not just the NEA, but of the different agencies, sitting with us on a regular basis. And so it'll take a while. And State Department of Transportations are a little bit more difficult than maybe someone else. But on the Livernois project, it happens to be that the Detroit bus system is a real mess. It's very problematic. And one of the things that has been talked about is that if you can actually think more creatively about those corridors, from how are they built out, what are the kinds of activities, that of course that involves the transportation system. And it implicates, where do you run the buses? Where do you not run the buses? Where are the stops? What do you do around the stops? And so I think there is sort of an organic sort of fusion that may well occur if we just sort of keep at the concept and don't let people off the hook.
Well, and I was at a meeting with you where the M1 rail project came up, and you were actually quite eloquent about the room for artists to get involved in that project, even though the word art doesn't appear, right? You could get every M1. Does everyone know what M1 is?
No, this is
Can you give us
This is the, Detroit has been, as you might imagine, sort of hostile to mass transportation. GM is not crazy about running light rail up and down its corridor. But I think that's changed. And what we have done over the last 5 years is put together a consortium led by foundations, actually, to build a light rail line up Woodward Avenue, with the idea that this, again, is the spine, that you can sort of then attach bus routes, paratransit, whatever you need along the route. But we had the NEA in town a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the multiple ways in which arts just has to infuse that project, because someone was saying, well, you have to make the stops look nice. And I said, yeah, sure, we'll do that. But here you're sort of reinventing community nodes. Why wouldn't you ask the artist to sort of think about what communities are you going through, what kind of identity issues are involved? Could you get local artists involved in planning and organizing, not just sort of putting sculptures on the top of a bus stop? I mean, there are 10 million ways in which it seems to me that if artists are involved at the front end rather than attached at the back end, that they can help actually change the nature of the project. I mean, the engineering will sort of be the same, and I embarrassed Steve earlier, but Project for Public Spaces did this a number of years ago when I was in Minneapolis. We were having a terrible fight along our major arterial in Minneapolis called Lake Street. And the transportation department just wanted to bust it open and widen the lanes and reduce the sidewalk widths and all of that stuff. And one of the most effective tools that they developed to sort of serve as a counterweight to that is to get the Hispanic arts community involved, because they talked in a different way about how the street was used and how murals would be used. And over time, how this had to sort of not just sort of be sort of symbolic gestures of art, but art had to infuse the way the street worked, because the Hispanic community would close the street for festivals and arts activities of all kinds. So it was a great example of Project for Public Spaces coming in and really helping us understand how these systems need to mesh.
Well, and just one of the things that always so impressed me about Rip and about his colleagues at Kresge, I spent 10 years essentially working at the Museum of Modern Art, so I often think of art as commodity, or art as object, art as thing. And as a foundation, you guys are all so eloquent about art as a process, as a way of thinking, as a problem-solving frame. And to think about applying a different set of problem-solving skills to a challenge is just really interesting. I think I saw a hand somewhere over here, and then we'll get to Bob, and then we'll come over to House Left.
Hi, I'm Amy Schiller. If I can list a couple credentials, I'm a student here at the Grad Center. I'm a fundraiser. My sister-in-law writes for HowlRound and is a playwright, and I'm a Clevelander. So
Oh, right. I was born in Cleveland.
Oh, Shaker Heights.
Excellent.
Bedford. Great. We'll talk. So in my experience, particularly in fundraising, I find there's a trend where the younger generation of philanthropists is less driven by place, less driven by tribe, and more driven to sort of fulfilling basic needs in like all throughout the globe, like more interested in poverty in Africa than even poverty in Detroit. So part one of my question would be, there's obviously a proud tradition among Kresge and the foundation partners that you've listed of supporting the arts. Do you think that can continue or can be translated to a younger generation of philanthropists that may have different priorities? The second part of my question is, what concerns me is that in making what you are essentially making here quite eloquently, which is a market-driven case for the arts, right? That arts support the economy, that may in turn generate interest among this younger generation of philanthropists, but it may also crowd out other justifications for the arts that are less market-friendly. So there you go.
Excellent. Well, can I take number two?
Yeah,
because I care a lot about this.
Yeah.
So what's interesting to me is I listed 6 or 7 extraordinary things that the arts do, 4 of which I said that the arts do uniquely. And what you heard from what I said was that I was only making an economic market argument based on the dollars. So this is an interesting thing that happens where we kind of, I think, collapse that conversation. And I think a lot of folks in this room might know Holly Sidford, a fabulous researcher who's done a lot of important work in the art space. And she and I were recently talking about the study Gifts of the Muse that I think a lot of folks know, that kind of brought this notion of intrinsic benefits of the arts, the intrinsic value of the arts, and the instrumental value of the arts. And what I said to Holly in a very friendly way is, I actually think that's outlived its purpose. I think that's really important that it did that, but I don't actually feel a need to differentiate among the benefits of the arts, because they all happen. They're all happening at the same time. And one of the things that art does so extraordinarily well is engender negative capability. So more than one thing can be true at the same time, some of which are even contradictory. But when we switch into our advocacy hats, or when we switch into our administrator hats, we sort of only allow one thing to be true. And if the arts have an economic benefit, somehow that eclipses the social cohesion, or the ability that the arts go to integrating society, or the role they play in helping the welfare of children. So I think it's interesting, because I think it's a conversation we need to have more, because I think people are used to hearing what we said last year and not necessarily having the new conversation that I think collectively we may be ready to hear. But on the sort of generational philanthropy, you've worked with some families over your career.
No, it's a spectacularly interesting question. I would hope that the ecology of philanthropy is sufficiently large to accommodate both. I used to get really annoyed with folks, frankly, who would work only outside of the United States, and not because it isn't unbelievably important work, and not because their marginal investment couldn't really do tremendous good. But it was sort of, we're kind of done with that. You know, we're done with domestic complexity, and it's sort of a built-out ecology, and therefore we're not going to get messed up with it. But I think what has happened is it's the philanthropic ecology is just more and more diversified. And so I think I see as many people who are really interested in starting small family foundations to work in rural America as I see folks who are trying to make sure that mosquito netting gets into Nigeria. I mean, I hope it's both. And one of I think the extraordinary things is we now sort of assume that philanthropy has always been big and complex and robust, but it's a relatively recent phenomenon in this country. I mean, if you go back 30 years, you didn't have this sort of enormous proliferation of family foundations and individual giving. We've always had individual giving, obviously, but I would like to believe that opportunity will always attract interest, and I think it has.
Well, that's a lot of my dissertation.
Oh, excellent. Oh, good. Am I right or wrong, do you think?
I don't know yet.
Oh,
So she'll get back to you.
Yeah.
6 years.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Really interesting question.
I think we had a question here from Bob Lynch, and anyone who doesn't know Bob is the head of Americans for the Arts, which fights on behalf of the arts ecosystem in this country every day.
Are we really going to let him ask the question?
Absolutely. Because it's going to be a softball.
I don't think so.
It actually kind of spins off the last two questions, and it has to do not at the national level, but at the local level. Americans for the Arts has some 3,000 local arts enabling organizations of one kind or another, and they often are thinking of themselves not just as arts organizations, but as community development through the arts organizations. And one of the things that I get to do, it's a privilege, is to go to a different city every week. And what I see out there in any city is kind of what we hear in this room, is a series of coexisting visions. So different people want different things. They all want a better community, but some of them, like a Chamber of Commerce, might want it through economics, and some of them might want it for the citizens themselves. Some want it for tourism. Mayors are the people I love to work with the most because they all want to say yes to everything. City managers all want to say no to everything, all of that. And so with all of these coexisting visions, it seems to me that the cities that I've seen that really get it and make a quantum leap forward are the ones that have figured out how to bring those different visions together, like a Rocco walking around the hill. Tools for that in the past have been things like cultural plans or town halls, or some communities will bring a United Arts Fund together. I'm wondering if you've both thought about that, and if there are new tools in mind for if you also agree with the idea that there are these wonderful, not competing, but coexisting visions that can be, if brought together, can actually get to the dream.
Yes, I have a quick yes. Do you want a minute to think? I can vamp.
Yeah, why don't you?
No, I think that's exactly right. And what I find interesting, and what I think we've seen in our work with ArtPlace, is that if you take the community as your unit of analysis, if you draw the circle around the entire community, all of those competing visions can coexist because they're all interested in the same thing. So I was just out in San Francisco, and I think a lot of you might know the Tenderloin District, which is a very sort of durably difficult place. I think 6 people were shot on Turk Street the week before I was out there. So talk about competing visions. You have 40% of the housing stock.
You have nothing to do with that, right? You have nothing to do with that.
No, it was before I came. There were 8 people shot. No, the week after. But what's interesting is, so you have these competing visions, right? We need to address the people who are living in the SROs. We need to deal with street safety. Someone just opened up a center for new and modern music on this block. There are parking issues. There are all of these things. And what I thought was really powerful is that the city government seeded a conversation of everyone around the table, and the conversation became, we all really care about the Tenderloin. How do we make this block safe? So the city of San Francisco said, we're going to actually eliminate parking on the street, because on this street, cars are used as a place to do lots of illicit things. Drug deals go down in cars, people are turning tricks, bad stuff is happening in and around cars. So we're going to get rid of all the cars. So all of a sudden the streets were safe and people said, well, I'm walking down them for the first time ever. So there are 2 or 3 arts organizations that are somewhat newly on that block who all of a sudden said, oh, people aren't scared to come walk down the street anymore. They can see where we are and they don't have to walk through sort of thing. Maybe we could do something out on the street. Maybe we could be helpful. There's an amazing philanthropic colleague of ours called Frances Phillips who works at the Haas Fund out there. And she talked about the fact that there's a huge number of families living in the Tenderloin, but you would never know it because no one lets their children play on the street. So all the protective parents have sort of built lives with their backs to the street so they can keep their children inside and protected. And all of a sudden we had opportunities to invite the children out. So all of a sudden these competing visions, when you start saying what do we care about and what we care about as the community, really become, you know, I don't know if it's sort of strands of hair that are being braided together. I don't know what the right analogy is, but it's no longer things that are sort of oppositional. It's things that are moving together in the same direction. I think it's really powerful. So I would encourage us to actually use the community organizing techniques we've discovered in the arts, the cultural planning, the town hall, and say, let's make the cultural piece a subset. And let's have a conversation about the future of this community and have one strong element of it be art and culture. So I think we actually have a powerful ability to lead this and to model good behavior by doing it. So I think it's really fascinating.
Maybe just a variation. I think this is one of those times where, at the risk of being too general, context is everything. How you come at the question of sort of the stickiness of these opportunities, ideas, inputs in Minneapolis is very different from Detroit, is very different from New York. We had Kate Levin come out to Detroit a month ago, and I think she was genuinely in complete and utter shock. I mean, you know,
former commissioner of cultural affairs for New York City.
Yeah, I mean, she didn't know, because that same question was asked of her. What would you invent here? And the New York experience of the Office of Cultural Affairs, with all of its access, all of its sophistication, all of its sort of layered activity, didn't take. You know, it just didn't take. But I think the reason Jamie's work is going to be so important is that I think if you pose the question, it's almost like flypaper. I think something will attach to it. Whether in Minneapolis it's an Office of Cultural Affairs, which is what we tried to set up. In Pittsburgh, it's probably the Heinz Foundation, just constantly asking this question, pushing the stuff on the table. In Lanesboro, Minnesota, it may be the head of the theater that is sort of anchored the ecotourism for the city. But and this isn't really an answer that's adequate, but I do think that you almost have to lead with the belief that it should happen, and then permit places to sort of self-select and self-design. That begs the question of then what tools do you provide? But I think we have lots of tools, actually. And I think this is one of those times where philanthropy is a huge asset. When you think about the McKnight Foundation in Minneapolis, the Kresge Foundation in Detroit, the Heinz Foundation in Pittsburgh, the Bloomberg Foundation everywhere. You know, these are folks who have the sort of the mantle of neutrality, who have networks they can tap, and so I think I guess I'm just repeating myself. I think that it will end up manifesting in lots and lots of different ways, and I guess I've sort of moved beyond the idea that we have to sort of develop I know you're not suggesting that, but develop a single tool that sort of you retrofit in multiple locations. Yeah.
Excellent.
Maybe 2 more.
I was going to say, let's go to Diane, and then we'll come over here to someone on House Left. So, Diane.
Diane Coffey, I was there.
Into the mic so the people at home can hear you.
I don't think it works.
It does
Oh,
work.
yes, it does work.
Don't be grumpy.
I was Mayor Kresge's chief of staff, but I had the arts in my portfolio. And I'm also a member of the board of Jazz and Lincoln Center, so I want to thank you for our grant from Kresge, which we received.
It's a proud
Which is
moment for us.
very important.
Thank you.
But I wanted to say congratulations, Frank, also for bringing you here, for creating the idea, because the conversation and the dialogue is really important. And the idea that you are already working with Bloomberg Associates, clearly. That was part of my question, because I assumed you would, Jamie, because Jamie knows everybody. And
I only know people that worked with Diane at some point. That's what they all, she's what everyone I know has in common.
But I think it's critical because there is this wonderful overlap that can exist among all the disciplines which you cited earlier and which Kresge has done and which you were trying to do. So it's congratulations to everybody, but I wanted to know what you felt was your most successful venture in terms of your goals and of all the things. I mean, we've only touched on a few here in Detroit, but what would you feel would be your best joint venture?
What is our best joint venture? I have 134 best joint ventures, which is the number of grants we've made. What I think is so interesting is one of the things we're encouraged, I mean, there's a big conversation I think that happens in philanthropy about defining success and outcomes and analysis and, you know, all these sort of tedious words. And really what they're trying to get at is asking organizations, what are you trying to do? And how are you going to know whether you've done it? And so what we're really interested in doing is taking a page from an organization like Creative Capital, which is a fabulous grant-making organization that works with individual artists, and talk with each project about defining success in its own terms. So I was just in Philadelphia last week. I took Amtrak there, and there's a great, beautiful Amtrak station in Philadelphia, 30th Street Station, and outside it is one of the most ugly public plazas, underused, inhospitable, that had ever existed. So a group, the University Development group, got together and said, we really want to activate this space. And so they just started putting out chairs and tables. They put out some flowers in a temporary thing, and all of a sudden people started using the space and taking a page out of, you know, sort of our great forefathers and foremothers in urban planning. They actually started tracking. Every hour they sent someone out to make notes on how people were using the space. And then they would change where they had the chairs and where they had the tables. They would add umbrellas, they would move the planters. And they've done this for a year now, 2 years, something like that. And when they get ready to do the permanent capital project, they'll actually have 2 years worth of data on how people are using that space. And when I was there visiting it, a group came up from Baltimore to see what they were doing because they wanted to do it too. So I think that's a fabulously successful project. I think what Livernois has done with the pop-up stores created by artists and entrepreneurs is a fabulous example. I was, where else have I been? I've been so many places. San Jose. There's some great things going on with an organization called MACLA, a visual and performing arts organization that's a community organization that's really become an anchor and really sort of brought people to that neighborhood. And then I don't think it's an ArtPlace officially function unless I bring up this fabulous group called Springboard for the Arts out of St. Paul, which is everybody's favorite.
Yeah.
And going back actually to the transit-oriented development question, there was a light rail project in St. Paul that was going to take 3 or 4 years to complete. And as everyone knows, one of the things that's true about transit-oriented development projects is they're awful, right? If you're a resident, it stinks to live next to all that construction for 3 years. And if you're a business owner, forget it. As soon as you get known as being under construction, there's no parking, there are traffic jams. I'm not going to go to that Rite Aid, I'm going to Rite Aid across town. I'm not eating at that Thai restaurant, I'll eat at a Thai restaurant across town, all of that. So this group trained a team of artists and said, here's how you work with your community. Then they gave them each a micro grant and said, go out and find a business and figure out something to do. We don't care what it is, just figure out something to do. So over 2 years, 100 events were self-produced. And it was maybe a jazz performance in the Thai restaurant. It was maybe a mural painted on the outside of someone else. Someone else had a book sale. Someone else did face painting. And they did all of these events. And then they tracked what was happening to the reputation of that neighborhood. And they essentially used something like Google Alerts. And they tracked to see how many times was this neighborhood mentioned within 3 words of traffic jam, and how many times was this neighborhood mentioned within 3 words of cool thing to do Friday night. And over 2 years, they moved the reputation of that neighborhood from a place to be avoided into a destination, which was really interesting, which meant people got used to the idea of going to that neighborhood. So when the light rail opens next month, people are actually going to take it because they know there are things to do. So I think all 4 of those are really exciting projects. Each achieve success on its own terms, and I'm equally happy about all of them. So did I go on too long, or do we have time for one more?
That's great.
I don't know if you want to answer, but successful or maybe
I was going to give you a non-answer just because of something I said earlier, and because I just wanted to say, it's not really a project, but it is, I think, a milestone in the history of Detroit. And again, Kresge funds, as you know, all over the country. We're not just about Detroit. But when the Detroit Art Institute, when it became likely that the creditors in the bankruptcy were going to begin stripping away the assets of the Detroit Art Institute, because those assets are in large part city-owned, it was an existential crisis for the city. Because it wasn't clear whether the creditors had that legal right or whether it would be trumped by the rights of the pensioners to have their obligations met. So at any rate, make a very long story short, we have created a vehicle called the Art Trust, in which the foundation community has pooled capital that will then be matched by the state, that will then have some similar contribution from the Art Institute. And it's enough essentially to it's almost $900 million. The foundation community put in almost $400 million. Ford Foundation put in 125, we put in 100, and that's just going right into our endowment and taking it out. It's not saying we're going to just redirect our money. And so the foundation community put in almost 400, the state put in about 350, the institute itself put in 100. At any rate, the long and the short of it is that we have a long way to go to the bankruptcy, but it appears clear that this is a sufficient amount of money, both to essentially we will give it to the emergency manager. The emergency manager will then transfer the asset into a new nonprofit that has no ties to the city whatsoever and is completely protected legally. And he will then use those monies to help buffer the effects on pensioners. And the police and fire pensioners are now up at 100% of their entitlement, and the general pensioners will be in the neighborhood of 95%. The reason I mention that is that I think it signaled the extent to which art became not an asset of the city of Detroit, but arguably one of the very most important assets of the city of Detroit. And I don't think the city thought about it that way. The creditors sort of did, but it was just money to be stripped, sell a Bruegel and be done with it. But for the city to rally around its institution that way, in the middle of all of this duress, in the middle of all of this pain, and to say it is important, so important to us as an asset in so many different ways, not just sort of classic elitism, but just as a place that substitutes in many ways for Detroit's history and identity. It's really a remarkable thing. I'm not sure it's duplicable anywhere else, but it's, I think, a remarkable thing, and I think and the art is safe. It will not be sold.
And I think one of the powerful things about how important this was, it wasn't just national foundations. The community foundation has played a really important
Well, I should say, yes, I should say that of the 400 million, the only two national foundations that got in the mix, other than Kresge, were the Ford Foundation, which is, of course, the Ford family, Detroit, and the Knight Foundation, which used to have a newspaper. All of the rest was raised by local foundation in batches of 10 and 20 and $30 million. Still significant for them, but these are small foundations who took a real hit. So anyway.
So I think, is that time?
Maybe I go ahead, it's a time. And again, thank you both for coming.
Thank you.